are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Talk about some nerve. Drug manufacturer Merck, that's MERCK, in case you want to know who to tag on social media. Drug manufacturer Merck has sued the government to protect itself from the horrible fate of actually having to negotiate its prices with the American people. Here to talk about that with us now is our good friend Merith Basey, and as long as we're in a spelling mood, that's Merith. Basey, Basey, not related to Count Basie, I guess. She is the executive director of the bipartisan, I prefer the term nonpartisan, actually, advocacy organization, Patients for Affordable Drugs, and its sister organization, Patients for Affordable Drugs Now. So, first of all, Merith Basey, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. I hope you're staying well in this air apocalypse. But let's go straight to Merck, shall we? Stipulating that neither you nor I are attorneys, so we're not going to talk about the legal merits of this case, but we can talk about the moral merits of it or lack thereof. First of all, and the political context of it, of course. So let's start with this. What is the law? Tell us a little bit about the law that prompted this action by Merck.
So at the end of the summer last year, there were key drug pricing reforms in the Inflation Reduction Act that passed. And one of the key pieces is, for the first time in more than 2 decades, Medicare soon is going to be able to negotiate drug prices, but not on all drugs and not for everyone, but for Medicare. And for 10 drugs starting in September, probably the most expensive ones, we will find out what that list looks like. But by 2029, that will be a total of 60 drugs that's going to save patients and the US government, we believe, over $25 billion as we go forward. So that is what this is about. But it's a really good thing for patients. It's a really good thing for people, and it's a first step in fighting back against the power of pharmaceutical corporations who seem only intent on price gouging people, out of their health and well-being, and certainly anything they have in their pockets.
You know, Merith, you and I have been, and you more so than I, but we've both been following this struggle over drug costs, drug prices for a long time. And first of all, remind me, how many other countries don't allow their government to negotiate drug prices with drug manufacturers?
So the US is the only high-income country in the world that doesn't negotiate drug prices. And guess what? This is why, a main reason why we also have here in the United States the highest drug prices in the world.
Yes, shocker. And when we think about it, first of all, and when we think back on this struggle and this debate, a policy debate, first we talked about all drugs being negotiable through Medicare. Then in the process of compromise, it was 20, if I recall correctly, 25 drugs. I think the Democratic House leadership said, well, let's start with 25. Now it's 10. Hopefully, as you say, the most expensive ones. But if anything, this is quite a moderated, to me, again, this is my point, but to me, it's a very moderated, toned down, first step toward negotiating drugs. And yet the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical corporation Merck seems to feel that this is some sort of totalitarian horror that's being inflicted on the American people. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about their rhetoric and the, not the legal, but the general, because every case like this is argued in 2 forums, right? It's argued in court, but it's also argued in the court of public opinion. So what's the case they're making to the public of why this is such a terrible thing and must be overthrown?
Well, they and I don't like to repeat their lies and myths, because we don't want to do that. But ultimately, they're calling this sort of tantamount to extortion, which is far beyond hyperbole and is just simply not true. The people, the corporations that have been extorting are pharmaceutical corporations. They are sort of the most profitable industry in the US. And I learned just the other day that if the industry overall lost $1 trillion with a T dollars over the next decade, they would still be the most profitable in the world. So
Wow.
they will be just fine.
No, yes, of course, they will be just fine. But on the other hand, it's the nature of greed to always want more, right? When you think about $1 trillion over a decade, that is, even in federal budget terms, enormous, and that would alleviate all sorts of concerns about Social Security, about Medicare overall, about any number of budget items. So it's a massive figure. And yet they don't want to give up even a nickel if they can.
No.
So they're arguing this case in court, based, I would assume, on the assumption on their part that their medications are going to be among those, subject to negotiation.
And
they think it's extortion, as in, they would be forced to, give up their product. Okay, so that's absurd, of course. But so, what kind of drugs are we talking about in the case of a company like Merck?
There's diabetes drugs, for example, for people living with type 2. And what they've said is that this is unconstitutional, right? So, but we talking to people who are lawyers and legal experts, we know that this is not only plainly constitutional, but it's entirely necessary. So again, some of the drugs that also do not have competition right now. This is the thing. They are concerned because they have managed to maintain their monopoly and hold people in this country hostage as a result of that monopoly, right?
So, and just, as I said, we're not lawyers, but just to explore that for a second. By their logic, one would think, okay, Lockheed Martin owns the patents to, and we could talk about patents, so I think we should in the drug industry, but let's say Lockheed or whoever builds the F-16 owns the patents on some of the technology. No one has ever argued that it's unconstitutional for Lockheed to negotiate with the government when the government chooses to purchase an F-16, do they? It's just a given practice, and our military budget is absurd. So if even our military budget negotiates, it seems to me insane for them to make that kind of argument. The courts will decide what they think about that. But at least I don't know the kind of government funding for research that goes into building an F-16. I assume there's quite a bit, but certainly many drugs, I think, for example, Zika vaccines, where research was funded by the U.S. government, paid directly to the French pharmaceutical company Sanofi, and then they patented it, Sanofi, rather than the government. I don't know specifically about Merck, but a great many of our medications that are privately patented by these corporations, or for which the corporations hold a patent, are actually produced by the government itself, aren't they?
100%. And that's the key piece that is forgotten, that most of, I think it's between 2010 and 2019, if you look at all the, I think around 350 drugs that were approved by the FDA, every single one of them has public money attached to them, in that initial stages of development, sort of de-risking some of that concern there about losing or loss of profit. So no, you're totally right. And also, I think in 2021, Merck was also trying to sell the US people of the US a drug that was being sold related to the treatment of COVID-19, a series of pills that in the UK would have been about $17, and they were trying to sell it back to American taxpayers at 40 times that price, despite it being developed with public funds. So
at how many times?
40 times the price. So
that's quite a markup.
It's if that was any other business, you'd say, goodness, that's rather profitable, and that's how they end up being the most profitable industry in the world, as we've mentioned. But I also should mention, you asked which drugs. One in particular for Merck that could be up for negotiation is a drug called Januvia, and I was just checking the data on this, but it's taken by about 1 million people right now on Medicare, and has been on the market since about 2006, and it has no competitors despite that. And Medicare Part D has spent $17 billion on the drug so far. So at what point is enough, right?
Right.
Right. And we know that for the average person who's taking this, it's going to cost around $547 a month, which is a huge amount of money.
And when you say it costs $547 a month, is that total, or is that the average out of pocket? Or
that will be for people, people on Medicare, because obviously it could be if you don't have insurance and you would need that. This is not even, the negotiation is not even going to impact you ultimately, or depending on what sort of plan you might have. This is not all Americans or all people in this country who might need it. And again, reminding folks that this is about negotiating a handful of drugs, 10 drugs, ultimately 60, just for people on Medicare, right? This is not, throughout the entire system, which is what we hope to get to. If I'm honest, it's, this is just the beginning, and we really do need to fight for that. And people deserve to be able to have access to the medicines they need and not be held hostage, as I mentioned, to the greed of pharmaceutical corporations. And knowing that 1 in 3 people in the US can't afford their medication, this is an urgent need and a top priority, I think, for everyone. And I think it's also one of the few, in many ways, you mentioned bipartisan in relation to our organization earlier, but this is one of the few issues that most Americans agree on. You talk to anyone pretty much anywhere in this country, and people will tell you that the price of drugs is too high. Right, of course. And, one of the things that I think many people who aren't familiar with Medicare don't necessarily understand, Merith, is that, first of all, it didn't cover medications till the early 2000s, and there was a lot of back and forth. Private insurance companies handle parts of that and so on. But they also don't realize that, unlike other forms of care under Medicare, drugs can be very expensive for Medicare patients. I know the founder of your organization, David Mitchell, has a form of cancer that causes him to spend a great deal out of pocket as a Medicare enrollee on these drugs. I have the precursor condition to that, which in all likelihood will never progress to what he has. But even so, just as a precursor, I spend a great deal on medications. And I feel fine, but it's expensive. And, there was a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act, as you well know, capping the total out-of-pocket spent by Medicare patients, but with a delay until 2026. Well, the delay will cost me $10,000, $15,000. It will cost other people more. That's if a Republican Congress doesn't manage to overrule it. And what gets left out, and the reason why I'm saying all this, what I think is important is that even when people don't pay a lot out of pocket, whether it's Medicare patients or whether they get the little coupons that you give this to your pharmacist and will cover part of the copay, the American people as a whole pay an enormous amount for this. And it shows up in
later in debates in Congress saying we can't afford to keep putting people on Medicare. Let's raise the Medicare age. Let's not cover this. Let's do that. Let's turn it over to the private sector. So really, that's the hidden cost, isn't it? Of this kind of greed. Maybe you could talk about that. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think I'm sorry to hear that you're paying so much for your medicine and just with those conditions. I mean, it's a concern to start with, and certainly if you come from another part of the world, you just have to focus on managing the disease or battling, the condition rather than thinking, well, goodness, is this going to bankrupt me? And we know that the number one reason for medical debt here, is medical related debt. But that Medicare Part D out-of-pocket cap actually comes in 2025.
Okay.
So a year earlier.
Great, I can save $5,000. Thank you for telling me. Yeah.
And it will be $2,000. So if you are paying, you mentioned David Mitchell, who's the founder, he has multiple myeloma, and the list price of those drugs is almost $1 million. I mean, just extraordinary. And so there is a large out-of-pocket payment, obviously, that will now be capped at $2,000 in 2025. So this is a really, really big deal. And also the plan hopefully is for this, that money, that $2,000 to be smoothed throughout the year. So you don't have to just pay $2,000 all at once, that you can actually plan. And for people who are retired and, don't necessarily have an income, this is going to be a really big deal in terms of just being able to sleep better at night, and also not worry about how, in the same way, I think, about maybe where that money is coming from, because we do hear that deep concern from many of the patients in our community from all over the country, in every single state, when they share their stories with us, and that's what we do to amplify them, right, on Capitol Hill, so that people can hear that these are real people's lives. This is not just a statistic, and we need to do whatever we can to make sure that the new drugs are available to people, but they have access to them. And to mention David, again, the founder of Patients for Affordable Drugs, his example is important to us too, because it is likely that at some point he will need a new version, right? As many other people with different conditions need that new innovation. So we are not saying, and this is, the Pharma Talking Point 101, this is going to impact innovation. Patients need new drugs. We are not against that. We are for that. But what's the point of having new drugs if people can't afford them? Drugs don't work if people can't afford them. And right now, even I think we've talked about this before, some of the new medications, these cell and gene therapies that are coming to market, we expect there's over 350 that are sort of potentially in the pipeline, which could be revolutionary. But revolutionary for who, even though the taxpayers paid for them, if they don't get into the hands of people who need them? And, the one that's set potentially for next year is, could impact a community of 100,000 people who are living with sickle cell, which disproportionately impacts, obviously, Black Americans and people around the world. So I think there's still a lot that we have to tackle in terms of drug pricing and making sure that we're lowering drug prices for everybody. And those are some of the things as well that we're thinking through, because, with Pharma here crying wolf, with this bogus lawsuit that we're going to push back against, and we expect more, by the way. This is just the beginning, but it is unsurprising, because anytime we chip away at their power and influence, they react as though they have been mortally wounded. But unfortunately, that is not the case.
Right, of course, exactly. And by the way, I think your hashtag for your organization, if people want to know more, we'll just mention it now and later as well, but it's P4AD now, is that right?
Yeah, you can find us, if you're on social media, it would be P4AD, I think underscore or P4AD now. So one, we do more educating, and one is is more on the lobbying front. So
it's a little hard to remember. I have to.
yeah.
It's a little bit like a Wi-Fi password, but P4AED underscore.
Yeah, but you can plug in patients for affordable drugs. That kind of, that's straightforward. Right. I should mention actually, what is key is that we don't take any money from pharmaceutical corporations. We don't take any money from anybody who may profit from the distribution or sale of drugs, which is key in this fight, right? Because it means that we are independent to be able to fight back, which is part of the challenge that we face with the influence of Big Pharma on Capitol Hill, who seem to fund everybody.
And it's amazing if you get a chronic illness, or if someone in your family does, all of a sudden you're getting this literature from these various nonprofit organizations for, various forms of cancer, asthma, whatever it may be, with people not realizing how much of that is being funded. In many cases by the pharmaceutical industry itself, to boost sales, to deflect criticism, to do that sort of thing. And this is a side comment, but it seems to me a lot of the lifestyle stuff that you find in those is also a way of almost flipping the blame back on the patient. I mean, sure, there are good lifestyle things you can do, but, affordable care is the best thing we can give people who have a chronic condition. So having said all of that, and having, in my case, my drug expenses alone could buy probably a couple Stinger missiles every year for the U.S. government. It's striking, isn't it, how this concern we seem to hear about debt and government deficits and the debt ceiling and the crisis and disappears when it comes to drug companies. Or am I too cynical? Because it seems to me in Washington, this would be number one, you know?
Yeah, I think it's you would think. I mean, that would be the logic, and you would think also that anybody elected, no worry where they come from, who they are, and which state, which background, which district. I think most people, you would think, would agree that people should be able to lead healthy lives and have access to medications that were funded by the public in the first place. But I think, as you know well, we just have to follow the money. And when you start to see how much money is paid to specific individuals, and how on Capitol Hill, but not just on Capitol Hill. One of the other things, and you can see this actually in a report that we did called The Hidden Hand, which looks at money that goes to patient groups, because and understandably they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, and they may be doing some great work, but it means they're not going to step out and talk about the need for lowering drug prices. So that there's the tentacles of the pharmaceutical industry are everywhere. And so now to see something like the Inflation Reduction Act and these reforms that are coming down the pike that are just going to chip a little bit of the way into the Medicare, people on Medicare, and the opportunity that they will have to, as I said, sleep better at night, have access to medicines, is a first step, but it's very key. But I think we have a lot further to go, and I think we know that this the Inflation Reduction Act is going to save a lot of money in terms of the drug pricing reforms for Medicare. So it should be a win-win.
It should be a win-win for everyone except the pharmaceutical companies. Yeah. There's also another aspect of this conversation that I think people should know about, Merith. And we've talked about it before, which is it doesn't require a new law. It requires using an relatively unused law, something called march-in rights, which is, and speaking of bipartisan, a law sponsored by a Republican and a Democrat, the late Robert Dole, and the late Birch Bayh, a Democrat. The Bayh-Dole Act, as I understand it, allows the federal government to step in if a patented drug is not being made widely available to people who need it, and either produce it itself or subcontract to another manufacturer, and to, compensate at a reasonable but not insane level the developers of that patent. And yet that doesn't seem to figure into this conversation at all. I mean, theoretically, I would think the White House could do that. I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that this is an option that's available, and that, a little tough love, maybe without the love part toward the pharmaceutical companies, might be, shape up, or we're going to cut you out of the picture altogether. It just seems to me that things have improved considerably in the Biden White House. I'll give them that, but that there's still a much too tolerant attitude overall in the national discourse about the greed of drug companies.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I think, there is a tool of options, and I know different groups are pushing in different ways, importantly, right, to try to do whatever is possible to lower drug prices. And that would be another one. I think there is a fight around a prostate cancer drug called Xtandi in particular that is being looked at, but it hasn't gone through. And it was, we're in this constant cycle, and it takes a really long time. That's the challenge too. These things take a long time. And as we've talked about before, the drug pricing reforms in the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to see the benefits in the future. They aren't all immediate, but I should mention that actually at the beginning of this year, vaccines for people on Medicare are free going forward, which is a big deal, because something like shingles is $200 a pop, which is not nothing. And then obviously the copay caps, obviously it's not lowering list price. You and I know the difference between this, but I think in terms of value to people and being able to afford insulin, which we know is been an issue for a long time in this country, despite, again, being a publicly funded drug that's been around for a long time. And then we actually have a report coming out next week looking at the benefits actually of the Inflation Reduction Act and these drug pricing reforms on people living with cancer, and the massive savings that I think are coming. So excited to be able to share that, but also recognizing that there will be some disappointment, I think, in September and going forward, that a lot of people are going to be hoping for their drugs to be covered.
Sure.
It's not perfect, but I think, back to sort of the Merck lawsuit, the people who are gaining at the expense of people's lives is really clear. And I think most people in this country understand how that happens and why that happens. And we're still going to fight back to make sure that people can get the medicine they need.
Yeah. My pharmacist, who's a fellow musician, apologizes when I pick up my medications. I'm sorry, man. It's like, it's not your fault. But before you go, just out of curiosity, we've heard that the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, wants to manufacture insulin for the residents of his state, rather than go through this rather curious, the inventors of it sold a patent for $3, which would be $52 now, but in inflation adjusted. But he's done what seems to me to be, no pun intended, patently obvious, which is to, we'll manufacture, particularly in the case of insulin, we'll manufacture it ourselves, particularly as you track the suspicious close rise of prices from the various individual manufacturers over time. What do you think of an idea like that?
I mean, we need more competition, and this is partly what this law is about too, right? Is allowing for competition. Insulin, over 90% of the volume of insulin sales is three massive pharmaceutical corporations, right? Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, Sanofi. And they control the market. They keep the prices high. And this is a perfect example of why these other initiatives are necessary. And it's also a risk for countries to be depending on these massive corporations when there are so many people who live with diabetes who really do need insulin every single day. And even with these copay caps, there's a lot of people who are not yet included with those copays. And I would love to see more people enter the market to lower drug prices through competition. That's really what this is all about. And in a free market, that should be the case. With insulin, we've seen them increase their prices in lockstep for decades. And that's why, people have been losing their lives because they have been forced to stretch insulin or not pay for it, or end up in the ER, right? There's other expenses that come that, as you were saying about hidden costs, like there's so much behind the ability to pay. So yes, I'm all for more competition. We should not be depending on these pharmaceutical corporations who set prices. And there was some celebration that some insulins, not all insulin prices, was lowered in theory, at least in the PR that we saw. But actually, talking to people who are living with diabetes will tell you that if they go to the pharmacy, they may not yet see that $35 price that has been announced in the press by these corporations. And because it's not the law, they could just as easily increase it tomorrow if they chose to. And people shouldn't be at the mercy of those decisions. So if there's anybody else who wants to start making medicine, I think it would do everyone literally a world of good.
And by the way, I think that the pharmaceutical companies are fortunate that their quote unquote opponents are people as rational and reasonable and even tempered as you guys, Merith, because if it were me, I would nationalize the companies overnight. I would seize the executive houses and use them as rehabs for opioid addicts and the other people, and treatment centers for the other people they've harmed. So they should be lucky that there are people like you who want to, rationalize and make this situation, this sector humane and rational with things like competition, fair play, regulation, and reasonable negotiation. So that's an endorsement of you.
I was like,
because I'll wind up in a.
Well, we have a long way to go, and if they're going to throw these bogus lawsuits at us, as we said, we'll fight back. But this is not the only line or front line that we're fighting on, and I know that the movement is growing, and yes. There's many other things that we can think through in terms of alternative policies that maybe we do need to put out there, because suddenly, as you said, all of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act and other reforms coming that we will be pushing for seem very reasonable.
Yes, indeed. Well, to find out more about your organization, I assume people should Google Patients for Affordable Drugs. Is that right?
That's great. Yeah, you should be able to find us there. And if people want to share their stories, they're welcome to, and we'd love to hear from you. And if and when we're organizing in person as well, there will be opportunities for people to join us in the fight against Merck and other corporations as we fight to make medicine more affordable for Americans and other people in this country.
All right. Well, we'll be looking for that report as well, Merith. Basey,
thank you.
Merith, Executive Director of Patients for Affordable Drugs and the Same Now. Thank you for your great work in this area, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.